Alex Carter had always lived on the edge of the present. A 29-year-old software engineer in New York City, he existed more in code than in conversation. No girlfriend, no weekends, just servers, algorithms, and late-night curiosity. The one thing that ever pulled at his soul, Titanic. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the photos, the music, the way a floating palace could vanish in a single night. His parents died when he was a child, and somehow the story of the Titanic always felt like a metaphor for his life. Majestic, but doomed. On the 113th anniversary of its sinking, Alex stayed late at his lab, tinkering with an unstable quantum simulation. Project Atlas, a program designed to model time as a fluid thread. But then, the thread snapped. The screen flashed white. The room trembled. His body lifted, then fell into darkness. When his eyes opened, the hum of machinery was gone. In its place, seagulls, music, laughter, the scent of sea salt and coal smoke. He stood on polished wood, velvet ropes, gilded railings, and there it was, carved into a brass plaque, glinting in the sun. RMS Titanic, April 10th, 1912. He had crossed the impossible. He was now a passenger on the world's most tragic ship. Alex staggered onto the promenade deck, lungs gasping for air that tasted like another century. The smell hit him first. Coal smoke, perfume, sea salt, unfamiliar yet deeply cinematic. His sneakers were gone. His hoodie, too. Instead, he wore polished leather shoes, stiff suspenders, and a starched white shirt that chafed his skin. He spun around wildly. Men in three-piece suits smoked pipes. Women in wide-brimmed hats whispered about silk and Vienna. A child rolled a hoop past him, laughing. No cars, no phones, no LED lights, only brass, wood, and that unmistakable hum of engines beneath the world's most luxurious ship. He clutched the railing, knuckles white. The vast Atlantic spread before him, endless, ancient. This wasn't a dream. This was time travel. He stumbled below deck, weaving through staircases and polished corridors. In a smoking room, he found it, a folded newspaper on a velvet chair. RMS Titanic sets sail, April 10th, 1912. His hands shook. It was real. He was on board the Titanic, 5 days before it would become a grave for over 1,500 souls. He leaned against the wall, breath shallow. Could he stop it? Should he? And then, a voice, like silk and music. You look as though you've seen a ghost. Alex turned, and the world collapsed around him. Standing before him was a young woman in a sky-blue gown, lace gloves wrapped delicately around a parasol. Her auburn hair shimmered in the afternoon light. Her eyes held oceans, and her smile, oh God, that smile, wasn't just beautiful. It was hauntingly familiar. Time froze. His brain screamed, "No way, no way! This isn't just any passenger. This is her, Evelyn Hartley." He had seen her name buried in footnotes, her face in faded black and white, one of the unknown heroines who gave her lifeboat seat to a child and vanished beneath the Atlantic. But she wasn't a tragedy here. She was alive, vibrant, smiling right at him, and far more beautiful than any book had dared to suggest. Alex's pulse slammed in his ears. "I'm Evelyn Hartley," she said gently. "First class." She extended a gloved hand. He hesitated, then took it. "I'm Alex, just visiting." She laughed, elegant and light. How very mysterious. As their hands touched, something surged, not electricity, but memory, a feeling like destiny. He knew in that moment, this wasn't just a historical disaster. This was personal now. He hadn't just landed on the Titanic. He'd collided with her story. That night, unable to sleep, Alex stood on the upper deck. Stars stretched forever above. The ship glided like a palace of dreams across the ink-dark ocean. And then, Evelyn appeared beside him, wrapped in a shawl. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. Alex shook his head. "Too much on my mind." She gazed at the stars. Isn't it strange how something so beautiful can hide so much danger underneath? Alex looked at her, eyes soft. "You have no idea." Their eyes met. In that moment, Alex made a silent vow. He would save her, even if it meant breaking history itself. By the morning of April 11th, Alex could barely hold it together. He had rewatched every documentary, read every transcript, memorized every tragic name. He knew what was coming. The iceberg, the radio warnings ignored, the overconfidence. And he had 5 days to stop it. But how do you rewrite history when no one believes you're from the future? He tried to be subtle at first. He approached the Marconi room, watching as Jack Phillips, one of Titanic's 2 wireless operators, cheerfully tapped out messages to Cape Race. Alex stood outside the doorway, palms sweating. "Have you received any iceberg reports?" he asked casually. Phillips glanced up, amused. "Several, actually. Typical for this route." Alex forced a smile. "You should keep those messages on file, especially from the Californian. They might be more important than you think." The man raised an eyebrow. "You with White Star?" "Just concerned," Alex muttered. "Very concerned." He left before he made things worse. Later that day, he joined a first-class afternoon tea with Margaret Brown, the unsinkable Molly Brown herself. Bold, opinionated, sharp. She laughed at his nervousness. "You don't seem the high society type, Mr. Carter." "I'm definitely not," Alex admitted. "But I do know something no one else here does. Try me." He leaned in, voice low. "The ship hits an iceberg 4 nights from now. 11:40 p.m., April 14th. Over 1,500 people will die." She stared, the humor gone from her face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you need to be ready. And if you can get lifeboats launched sooner..." She held up a hand. "This sounds like madness, or a con." Alex felt a chill crawl up his spine. The moment he pushed too hard, the walls went up. She stood. "Enjoy the voyage, Mr. Carter." Another wall, another locked door. Desperation turned into action. That night, Alex slipped below deck, memorized the path to the bridge. He found the steering plans, the coordinates, the crew schedule. He even considered sneaking into the engine room to sabotage propulsion, slow the ship down. But that would risk lives too soon. He was spiraling. Only Evelyn grounded him. They walked the deck that night, moonlight silvering her hair. "You're carrying something," she said softly. "I see it in your eyes, like you're fighting the whole ocean." He looked at her, aching. "You ever feel like you're the only one who knows how the story ends, but no one will listen?" She paused, looked out at the dark sea. "Then maybe you're not here to change the story," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe you're here to change the way it's remembered." Alex felt his heart clench. How could she be so close to the truth, without knowing? But just as hope returned, he felt it, a presence, watching. From the shadows near the smokestack, a man in a dark overcoat stood still, barely lit. Alex turned, but the man vanished. Someone else knew, and time wasn't just fragile. It was being watched. Alex was still haunted by the man in the overcoat. Tall, still, silent. That image, standing near the smokestack, then vanishing like vapor, had etched itself into his mind. He'd seen no record of such a person in the Titanic's passenger lists. No officer dressed like that. And yet, he was real. By April 12th, the atmosphere shifted. Something or someone was closing in. That evening, Alex retreated to the first-class library, hoping to breathe, to think. He sat at a mahogany desk, books he couldn't focus on open in front of him. Then, the scent of tobacco drifted in. "You've been busy." The voice was smooth, educated, British, dangerous. Alex turned. The man in the overcoat stepped out from behind a bookshelf. Pale blue eyes, impeccably dressed, clean-shaven, hands gloved in black leather. But what chilled Alex was the gold watch in his vest pocket, glowing faintly and not ticking. Time traveler. Alex stood slowly. "Who are you?" The man gave a faint smile. "Name's Morgan Thorne, and I think we have a problem." Alex's jaw tightened. "You're not supposed to be here." "Oh, I am," Morgan said calmly. "You? Not so much." He circled the desk, voice smooth like poison. "You cracked something. Atlas, wasn't it? The simulation. You weren't supposed to activate that sequence." "I didn't mean to," Alex said. "But I'm here now, and I can't just watch this ship sink." Morgan sighed. Typical. First-timers always want to play God. Alex stepped forward. "If you know what's going to happen, you could help me stop it. Warn the crew. Save them." Morgan's eyes darkened. "You think this ship is a tragedy, but it's a keystone, a fixed event. Without it, entire timelines collapse. The war, the treaties, the births, the inventions, even your family, your sister." Alex froze. Morgan smiled colder now. "Yes, I've been watching you. Your history, your bloodline. You were born because the Titanic sank. If you save this ship, you'll be saving strangers, but erasing yourself." Alex clenched his fists. "That's not your call." "It's not yours either," Morgan snapped. "You think you're the first. I've stopped 24 others, from Rome to Hiroshima. I don't preserve history because I love it. I preserve it because without order, all that's left is chaos." He stepped close, voice dropping to a whisper. "You are the anomaly, Alex, and I am the correction." The gold watch ticked once, just once. Then he turned to leave. "Oh, and if you get in my way again..." Morgan's eyes locked with his. "I won't erase the ship. I'll erase you." As he disappeared down the hallway, Evelyn appeared from behind the far corner, her eyes wide. She had seen everything, heard enough. Alex didn't know what scared him more, Morgan's threat, or the question now in Evelyn's eyes. Who exactly was Alex Carter? April 14th, 1912, 9:45 p.m. The stars above were so still, so uncaring. The sea below, black, glassy, silent. Titanic surged forward at full speed, oblivious to the monster hiding in the dark ahead. Alex stood on the deck, pulse roaring in his ears. His fingers clutched the note he'd scribbled hours ago. Icefield coordinates: 41.7325 degrees north, 49.9469 degrees west. Estimated impact: 11:40 p.m. Evelyn's voice echoed from earlier that day. "You're not telling me everything." She was right. She had seen Morgan. She had seen Alex's fear. But there was no time now to explain the impossible. Only time to act. 10:05 p.m. Alex crept toward the Marconi room. Sparks crackled softly from the repaired wireless equipment. Jack Phillips was too busy sending out passenger messages to notice him slip in. Alex reached under the table, pulled the backup frequency regulator he had rewired earlier. If this worked, The incoming iceberg warnings would finally be prioritized, forced through the system. Suddenly, a hand slammed the door behind him. "Morgan, you just don't listen," he hissed. His coat was wet, his gloves off, revealing a strange device strapped to his wrist, pulsing, alive. "You think you can play hero? This is your final mistake." He lunged. They crashed into the equipment, knocking cables and sending sparks flying. Alex threw a desperate punch, connected with Morgan's jaw, but the older man recovered fast, eyes glowing with fury. "You weren't meant to exist!" Morgan roared, slamming Alex into the wall. Alex grabbed the regulator and jammed it into the console, rerouting all frequencies. "Caution! Ice ahead!" blinked on the transmitter. "You fool!" Morgan shouted, smashing the machine, but it was too late. 10:55 p.m. Alex sprinted towards the bridge. Blood ran down his temple. His lungs burned. He shoved open the heavy door. "Iceberg dead ahead! Change course!" The crew looked stunned. One officer grabbed him. "You again? I warned you before!" Suddenly, the lookout's bell rang above. 3 clangs. Ice ahead. Captain Smith stepped forward. "Hard a starboard! Full reverse!" The command rang out. Titanic groaned, shuddered. Alex staggered to the edge of the wheelhouse, watching through the darkness. There it was, a towering white wall, jagged, unforgiving. The ship tilted, veering, screaming, protesting against inertia. And then, silence. The iceberg slipped past. Barely. Gasps, shouts, confusion. But not panic. They had missed it. Alex collapsed to his knees. He had done it. He had changed history. Until he looked up and saw Morgan standing at the far end of the deck, soaked, furious, but smiling. He raised his glowing wrist device, aimed it at the sky. "Congratulations, Alex," he said. "You just broke time." A shock wave of white light surged out across the Atlantic. The stars above flickered, some blinking out. Reality itself began to ripple. And Evelyn, watching from the stairwell, whispered only one word. "Alex." April 15th, 1912. 7 a.m. Titanic cut through the morning mist, proud and perfect. There were no lifeboats missing, no tears, no names to be mourned. Passengers strolled the deck with tea and smiles, speaking of a near miss with amusement. Newspapers would soon call it a triumph of seamanship. But Alex Carter felt nothing but dread. He sat alone in the smoking room, hands trembling over a cup of untouched tea. The world looked normal, too normal, and that terrified him more than the iceberg ever could. He reached into his pocket, the photograph of his sister. She was gone, not faded, erased. Her face missing, the ink warped. Time was changing and erasing everything that wasn't supposed to be. Alex stumbled to his feet. He ran through the corridors, through the salons and promenades, past joyful voices and blissful ignorance. He needed answers, proof. He found it in the library, a book on world leaders. But the pages were wrong. The US president wasn't Roosevelt. It was someone else, someone Alex had never heard of. A chapter on technology mentioned airships dominating transatlantic travel, not airplanes. World War I had never ended. Instead, it mutated into a 3-continent arms race, fueled by empires that never fell. He dropped the book. He hadn't saved history, he had broken it. Then came the voice he dreaded. "You thought you were the hero?" Morgan Thorne emerged from behind the shelves, looking older, as if time had started decaying him too. Alex stepped back. "You said this would happen. I told you Titanic was a fixed point. Its sinking was a scar, but a scar the world healed around. Without that scar, history grows wild, twisted. Alex's voice cracked. "Then tell me how to fix it." Morgan looked at him long and hard. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a second device, glowing faintly. The chrono anchor. One jump, one reset. "You go back. Stop yourself from interfering. Let it happen." Alex's chest heaved. "And Evelyn?" Morgan hesitated. "She wasn't supposed to live." Silence. Alex felt his entire soul fracture. "She changed everything," Morgan added. "You brought emotion into time. That's the most dangerous variable." That night, Alex stood with Evelyn at the stern, the sea calm behind them. She looked up at him. "You're going somewhere, aren't you?" He nodded. Her voice trembled. "I don't want you to go." His hand found hers. "I don't want to leave you either." He gave her the letter he'd written, sealed in wax. "If you remember anything at all, look for this." She didn't understand. Not fully, but she kissed him like she did. He stepped back, clutched the device, pressed it. Light, pressure, screaming silence. Then, darkness. He opened his eyes in the lab. The screen blinked, the lights flickered. April 15th. His time. Titanic had sunk. History had restored itself. He reached into his jacket, the photograph of his sister, whole again. But as he turned to leave, a letter sat on his desk. Old, yellowed, wax sealed. He opened it with shaking hands. "If you remember anything at all, look for this. E.H." Alex dropped to his knees. Somehow, she remembered. Even time couldn't erase everything. The lab was silent, but Alex's mind roared. It had been 3 days since the jump, 3 days back in the present. But nothing felt real anymore. He walked through Times Square. The lights were blinding, the noise unbearable. People laughed, yelled, filmed TikToks, rushed from Subway to Starbucks. And yet, Alex felt like a ghost among them. Because he remembered a ship where laughter was different, softer, where time moved slowly, like dancing violins, where a girl in a blue gown held his hand as if the world wasn't already breaking. Evelyn. She should be gone, a name in a grave beneath the sea. But he still felt her hand in his, still heard her voice, still saw the stars reflected in her eyes. And then there was the letter. Yellowed with time, sealed in wax, signed with initials that shouldn't have survived history. E.H., she remembered. Somehow, impossibly, she remembered. That night, Alex returned to the lab. He opened the folder labeled Project Atlas. The code still pulsed, a living network of possibilities, threads of time like veins on a map. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He had promised never to interfere again. But one question kept clawing at his soul. What if one thread was still open? He cross-referenced Titanic's passenger logs. Evelyn Hartley, still dead. No survivors under that name. But he checked the signature on the letter. E.H., the handwriting matched. The tone, the phrasing. That letter wasn't from the past. It was from a future that never happened. Alex began to dream again. Not of the iceberg, not of Morgan, but of Evelyn. Sometimes he saw her walking through Central Park, just out of reach. Sometimes she was in a library, reading his favorite book before he'd ever told her about it. And sometimes she whispered things only she could have known. She was out there, somewhere. A fragment of her had survived the reset, a ripple, a glitch, or maybe something deeper. One morning, he entered the lab to find a photograph on the floor. It hadn't been there before. It showed 3 people: Alex, his sister, and a young woman with a parasol, Evelyn. They stood in front of a museum exhibit, Titanic's bow in the background, but the year printed at the bottom, 2026. Alex blinked. He had no memory of this moment, but his hand was around hers. Her eyes were looking right at him. He sat down slowly. Tears welled in his eyes, not of sorrow, but awe. He hadn't saved Evelyn in the timeline he remembered, but maybe, just maybe, she had found a way back to him. And for the first time since returning, Alex Carter smiled. Because time had taken much, but it hadn't taken everything. The lab was quiet again. Sunlight bled through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the whiteboards, still filled with equations about time, entropy, and paradoxes. But Alex Carter didn't look at them anymore. He just sat there, holding the photo. Him, his sister, and Evelyn. She wasn't supposed to be there, but there she was, smiling, alive in the present. A version of her had survived, or returned, or rewritten herself in ways neither he nor Morgan could ever explain. Not even Atlas could track it, and Alex was done trying to understand. He walked to the old safe, entered the code for the last time, and retrieved the chrono anchor, cracked, scorched, inert. A broken relic from a broken moment. He placed it on the table beside a small note. For those who think they can save everything, read carefully. Then he stepped back and left it there. Because the truth was no longer about saving the past, but about living in the future, scars and all. In the months that followed, Alex changed. He stopped coding simulations of history. Instead, he lectured at obscure conferences, wrote under a pseudonym, articles titled, "Why Some Events Should Never Be Prevented." Time Travel and the Ethics of Loss. The Girl Who Remembered Me. No one knew they weren't fiction, except maybe one person. On a rainy spring afternoon, Alex stood outside the Titanic Memorial in New York. He didn't speak, just looked up at the names. And then she appeared, umbrella in hand, blue dress beneath a modern trench coat, eyes exactly as he remembered. Evelyn. She stood beside him without a word. "Been waiting long?" she asked softly. Alex swallowed. 113 years. She smiled. "I only remember pieces," she said. "But the stars, the music, you." Alex looked at her, his throat tight. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "That I let the ship sink?" She shook her head. "You didn't let it sink. You let it matter." They stood in silence. Two people who had once existed in separate centuries, now sharing the same breath. That night, Alex walked through Times Square, hand in hand with the impossible. The city buzzed as always, oblivious, fast, alive. But in one hidden alleyway, behind a locked vault, a device hummed faintly. The chrono anchor, dormant, pulsed once. A whisper, a flicker. Time never forgets. It simply waits. Enjoyed this dramatic journey through history? Subscribe for more thrilling time travel adventures. Comment below. If you could change one moment in history, would you do it?